Hi, I am Bong Lee, professor at Seoul National University, also project manager of Seoul National University Population Research Center. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's international symposium entitled Harnessing the Dynamics of Population Change in East Asia, hosted by Seoul National University Population Research Center. SNU Population Research Center is set up to carry out a leading research on population changes worldwide, but also it is set up to serve as a sort of platform to share knowledge and research findings on population change issues across the world. So again, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's important international symposium. Population change, as we all know, is probably the biggest social challenge we are facing in the 21st century. Particularly, East Asia region is experiencing a rapid population change. So the region, East Asia region, is probably the most important area where we want to take a look at the population change issues and also policy responses to rapid changes. In that sense, today's symposium is particularly important, I think, because the symposium is intended to focus on East Asia. So I'd like to welcome today's presenters, Professor Rong from Waseda University, Japan, also Professor Yen-hsin Cheng from Academia Sinica in Taiwan, and Professor Susanne Yuk-ping Choi from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And I'm very grateful these leading researchers my iPhone Siri is responding to my speech, so I had to stop her. Anyway, again, I'm very grateful for these leading researchers who will serve as presenters at today's symposium. I'd like also thank Professor Dong-Kyun at Department of Sociology here at Seoul National University, who is going to moderating today's session. Today's session is, in a sense, a very hybrid. We are in a conference room in Seoul National University. I am. Professor Dong-Kyun is currently in USA, in Oregon, who is joining us from using the Zoom, and we also have the other speakers joining us using the Zoom. So it's a international, but also very hybrid type of symposium today. Again, I'd like to welcome everyone, and I also would like to thank everyone who is going to do a presentation and also work as a moderator for the session. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Dong-Kyun. I'm at the Department of Sociology at Seoul National University, and I will be the moderator of today's symposium. So, okay, now I think we can begin our presentations. And so the whole session of the whole symposium will last for about 100 minutes. And each presentation will be given about like 25 minutes or so. And after we have all three presentations, then we'll have, collectively, we'll have a panel discussion together. So I will introduce you the first presenter. The first presenter is Professor Rong. And Professor Rong is an assistant professor of health economics at Waseda University, Japan. She earned her PhD from Graduate School of Economics of Waseda University, and her current work focuses on healthcare related issues in Japan. I heard that she is one of the kind of leading scholars in applied econometrics in Japan. So I'm very honored to introduce her. So Professor, can you start?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm gonna share a screen of my slide.
Oh, can I step in just for a second? So this event is now being broadcast on YouTube. So if you're watching, so most of the audience is watching this on YouTube. So if you have any questions or remarks or some comments or feedback, something like that, please leave your question in the comment section. So I will, if you are Korean and if you are more comfortable writing your question in Korean, you can write your questions or comments in Korean. I will translate them in our discussion section. Okay, sorry, please continue.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm Rong from Waseda University, and thanks a lot for Professor Im for the introduction. I'm very delighted today to have the chance to introduce some topics related to the dynamics of population change and its long-term care in Japan. First, just a very brief introduction of the demographic facts and trends in Japan. Japan has been well known as the oldest country in the world. And as the left figure showing you, the life expectancy at birth has been constantly increasing in Japan over the past decades. By 2050, it is expected to reach 90 years and 84 years for women and men respectively. A similar trend can be found for the life expectancy at age 65. Meanwhile, the population structure in Japan also evolved quite a bit. I think the size of population reached the peak at around 2011 and then gradually declining. So given the fact of increasing life expectancy, constantly low fertility rate, unfortunately is not a topic for today. It's not surprising to see the increasing of population, a share of population who aged 65 and above. So as this figure showing you that by the projection in 2060, 40% of Japanese population will reach 65 and above. Out of 10 people, 4 will be elderly. Unfortunately, Japan is not the only country in face of such a challenging demographic situation. But population aging is indeed an urgent and global issue. Particularly in comparison to Western countries, if you check the trends, I would say Asian countries are in face of more serious aging issues, with Korea highlighted in orange line, catching up with Japan at the fastest pace. So indeed, when we discuss the challenges and solutions for the issue related to population changing or dynamics of population changes, we'd better not locate the issue into any single country, but rather discuss the situation internationally or at least regionally for a more general solution. A related issue to population aging is the sustainability of the social security system. And in this case, more specifically, is about how to deal with the increased demand for healthcare. If we check this figure, I'll say medical cost by age for those who teenager, young adults, or even middle-aged population are quite stable. But once people reach 65 or retired, the medical costs drastically increased. And for the oldest old, I would say it's more than triple the size of it for middle-aged population. If we back to the topic of this presentation, because long-term care is very closely associated with the use of healthcare, we would also expect a drastic increase in the needs of long-term care as a result of population aging. So in light of the dynamic of population changes in East Asia, when we work on solutions for sustainability of social security system, it could be necessary to have an in-depth discussion in long-term care system in terms of its achievements and the challenges it is still in face of. But this backs the fact that long-term care is very much tightly tied or bundled with healthcare. Well, it's kind of aftermath of any medical treatments. They are indeed different from each other from several aspects. So compared to healthcare, long-term care is with relatively higher predictability in terms of the timing and amount of demand of the services utilization. And long-term care compared to healthcare is with relatively longer run of utilization, relatively lower information asymmetry, and because it's partly because the high predictability. And long-term care services are usually more labor intensive, where healthcare services are more technology intensive. The whole cohorts with the intensive care needs for long-term care, usually the oldest those who aged 85 and above. But for healthcare, it's relatively younger. When people reached retirement, they're more or less likely to use the services I just showed in the previous figure. So given all those differences between long-term care and healthcare, there has been a long history in Japan discussing whether or not and how to enactment a standalone system for long-term care. I just briefly summarize the history of long-term care in Japan. I think the very first discussion regarding long-term care services was in 1963 about the Act on Social Welfare Services for the Elderly. And after all those discussions, as we can find for Gold Plan, New Gold Plan, a lot of acts, finally in 2000, the Japanese government launched a standalone public and mandatory insurance system for long-term care, named as Long-Term Care Insurance System, or more popular or more well-known as the LTCI. So here I'm summarizing the structure of LTCI in Japan. You can figure out by colors, there are three entities or players in the systems: the insured individuals, the municipality or local governments, also known as the insurer, and the service providers, highlighted in green colors. Well, they are interplay with each other in multiple dimensions, and I'm gonna introduce one by one in the following slides. First, I would like to discuss or provide a bit more information about how the premium is delivered between the insured individuals to the municipality as the insureds. As the first beginning, who are the insureds? They're very important. As I just introduced, the long-term care insurance in Japan is mandatory insurance, public insurance system. So basically everyone, citizen in Japan, regardless of your nationality, those who aged over 40 years are required to pay premiums and enroll in the program. And they are basically divided into two groups by age. If you're aged over 65 and above, you are named as the primary insureds. And those who aged between 40 to 64, they're denoted as the secondary insureds. The following rows are showing you some basic statistics regarding the primary and secondary insureds. As of March of 2017, roughly 34 million of the population are primary insureds, and 42 million of them are secondary insureds, paying premiums every month. A key difference between the primary and secondary insurers are the services they can use and the criteria based on which they can apply for the services. For the primary insurers, basically, as long as you're aware of some care needs, you can apply for the services, and you will be, if you pass the tests, eligible to long-term care services. But for the secondary insurers, relatively younger cohorts, they can apply for the services only if they're suffering from age-related diagnoses, like terminal cancer or diseases, difficulties regarding mobility. Another key difference between the two groups is how the premium is collected. For the primary insurers, the premium is basically collected by the local governments, the municipalities, through the pension deduction, because anyway, the municipality need to pay deliver the pension, so directly deducted from the pension. But for the secondary insurers, most of them are still working. Actually, the premium is collected by the medical care insurers, together bundled with the medical care premiums every month. And if for employees, it's also directly deducted from the salary. And because it's a public and mandatory insurance system, the method how the financing or the cost is covered is very simple. It's a very simple formula. Half of the cost is covered by the premiums, either from the primary or the secondary premium, and half of the cost is covered by the subsidy. It can be from the national government or local governments like prefectures or municipalities. Here, I'm also showing you an image of how the premiums for the primary insurers is determined. It's a step-up premium system, and basically the benchmark or the standard premium is based on the standard income set by the government. And you're gonna, for the standard income individuals, the monthly premium is roughly 5,000 Japanese yen. I would say it's roughly 50,000 Korean won per month in 2014. And if your household income is above the taxable threshold, you're gonna pay more with the step up setting. And if your income, family or individual income is below the standard income, you are paying less with the standard down structure. After looking at the premium settings, I'm going to move on to another important interplay between insured individuals and municipality. That is how to apply for the services and how a care level is designated by the municipality. Insured individuals, particularly those who are primary insured, once they are aware of, self-aware of some care needs, the first thing they need to do is to apply for an eligibility test to the municipality. And the test is administered into two distinct stages. At the first stage, there is an interview. And the interview is arranged by an investigator who is basically a municipality officer in charge of this test. He or she must be very familiar with all the rules, protocols regarding long-term care services. And the interview is typically conducted together with the applicant's family members, particularly spouses or their sons, daughters. And this is particularly true for those applicants with dementia symptoms, because they need to cross-check the accuracy of all these items. The interview is based on a 75-item questionnaire designed to assess physical function, living function, cognitive function, behavior disorders, and the ability to adapt the social life of the applicants. And next slide, I'm showing the details of all those items. Each of the item is actually a multiple choice question. And so for example, a question in physical function, checking whether an individual can sit for a while is designed in this format. And out of the 4 options, it's ranging from capable of doing it to incapable of doing it. The investigator should choose the option closest to the status quo of the applicant. And the investigators can ask applicants to, in this case, sit for a while to confirm this ability. After all those 75 items are checked, there will be a computer program calculating a set of hypothetical care times based on the results of the questionnaires. There are 8 categories for the hypothetical care times, ranging from eating, mobility, to medical care. Each of them has the range of hypothetical times in minutes required for providing the services. This statistical program is utilizing a sample of 3,500 institutionalized in elderly individual. They are basically in nursing home, and for this sample, the type of services and the timing, how long the services has been provided over 48 hours are very much thoroughly documented. So based on this given sample, the algorithm will calculate the hypothetical care times applicant might be in need of. And by summing up the 8 categories of hypothetical care times, there will be a single dimension measure for the care needs. That is the standardized care time. I think this is the current version. The standardized care time ranges from 10 minutes to 230 minutes per day. And of course, along this distribution of standardized care time, the government can cut off by different categories to define the level of care needs. So based on this standardized care time, the test will move on to the second stage, where the long-term care needs certification committee will assign officially a care level to this applicant. And the care level is basically defined by the cutoff of the standardized care time. There are 7 care levels in Japan. I think this is very much the same as the care levels in German system. From the most moderate support required level 1 to the most severe care level 5. And each of these care level actually corresponds to different numbers of difficulties in ADLs and IADLs. And the care level, once assigned, it is not permanent. It is with a range of validity period. Usually it's 6 to 24 months. After this period, the applicant should renew the certificate for care level. And if your health status is deteriorating over time, then you might like upgrade to severe care level. And if your health status is improved, you might be downgraded to lighter care levels. Here I'm showing you a concrete example of how the care level certificate looks like. As you might well know that Japan is pretty much a paper-based country. So there's no digital certificate, it's all paper, this much size, I would say, with all documented information like the information for the insured, his name, address, birth date, with the type of services he or she might want to use and how frequently the service is provided, and the provider's information, which facility is providing the services from when to when. So all paperwork, not digital. Since the system is launched, the program is launched, the number of eligible insurers was constantly increasing over time. It's a good signal indicating that many of the Japanese elderly population actually enjoying or like at least covered by the program benefits. But on the other hand, when we health economists ever seen this figure, we always think, okay, financial sustainability of the system is really a problem, because as you can see in the latest statistic 2018, the number of insurers is tripled the size when the program was just launched. So how to make the system sustainable is the urgent issue. Next, as the third section of this structure, I would like to introduce how the insured individual, once they receive the certificates, how they apply for the services, utilize the services, and co-pay for the services. Once the individual receives the certificate from the committee, we usually name them recipients, care recipients. Care recipients basically apply for the services, use the services, but before the actual services, the services is really like provided, he or she needs to make a plan for what type of services, how frequently you want to use. And typically at the planning stage, they're gonna negotiate and communicate with care managers. I'm just translating Japanese care manager to English care manager. I'm not sure whether it makes sense, but basically those care managers are really specialists in all types of services available, and given the recipient's status, what type of service you might need. So given those professionals, a care plan will be made for each type of services. If elderly people is denoted as support requirement level 1 or 2, he or she will be eligible for preventative long-term care services with lighter frequency or tense of the service, preventing them to deteriorate to like real need of long-term care. And if elderly person certificate as care level 1 to 5, he will be eligible for long-term care services, or in the worst case, hospital or not institutionalized in nursing homes. But in either case, if you're receiving services at home, you need to make a plan with the care manager. And even if after all those tests, you are identified not eligible for long-term care, which is good news that actually you're still healthy, not in need of the services, you are actually still placed in a community support projects, really preventing you from utilizing even the preventative long-term care services. So, well, I would say as a Japanese elderly person, if you're self-aware of some care needs, you will be placed in some parts of the program and receive some of the benefits. Here is a concrete example of a care plan for care level 4 recipients. Information is like this old lady, aged 87 years old, cohabiting with her son and daughter-in-law. Basically, the schedule for a week is set in this format. Every morning, there will be toilet, bathing, feeding services provided. And for weekday, there will be more detailed and intensive care, like day service, day care provided. And for every night, weekdays, there will be also feeding, bathing services provided at home. Because she's cohabiting with her son, so during the weekend, less services are provided. But basically, it's a very comprehensive and general services schedule. And another thing when you utilize the services is people should be aware of the monthly cap that the services or the benefits can be used. In Japanese, it's named the tensu, or like translated into English is units. But basically for each care level, the unit is setting increasingly with respect to the care level. Upon to this unit, the cap, all the services are available at 10% co-insurance fees. So you can use any services you want, just pay 10% of the fee. But beyond this cap, if you want to use the services, you need to pay 100% out of your pocket. And if you check this cap, monthly cap in terms of unit, is reaching roughly, the highest is reaching roughly 400,000 Japanese yen per month. I would say it's very generous, because if we compare with the national average of salary, it's much higher than the average salary per month. Well, sounds risky if you use the services beyond the cap, but actually it's a stop loss setting. So even though you pay 100% out of your pocket beyond the cap, actually there is a refund system upon request based on your household income. And actually the real out of pocket per month is fixed at around 55,000 Japanese yen. So very generous. People do not really worry much about the capability or feasibility of the system. And another thing is actually people do not use much of the services reaching the cap. Here is a figure I borrowed from one of my colleagues who is also working on long-term care. Here, all the cutoffs are regarding the care levels. The dots are the real utilization, and the real utilization clustered at each standardized care time, and the dashed horizontal lines are for the cap. So you can see if we clustered by each of the care time, standardized care time, we don't see much of the services utilization really reach to the cap. People are very rational or reasonable in terms of the amount of services they want to use, or partly because the system is set as you have to discuss with care manager at the very beginning. So care managers are really aware of all those informations, and he or she might suggest you not to use this or that, or like if you add this service once a week, you're going to reach the cap. Are you really sure? Such type of communications is really helpful for the system to maintain. And as the last step, there is the reimbursement steps that the service providers will send the claims to the local government for the reimbursement, the remaining 90% of the fee. It's a monthly reimbursement system, and again, it's digital, but basically we check all those claims in paperwork for each individual. We have very detailed services recorded with the frequency, with the amount of money the government is gonna pay. So it's really a comprehensive and rich data set. We name it National Long-Term Care Database, or if we translate from Japanese, because long-term care in Japanese is kaigo, so it's starting with K, we call it KDB. KDB is really nice, comprehensive, and population admin data sets with up to March of 2018, 860 million records of monthly utilization and 50 million records for the eligibility test records. It's not perfectly open, but it's available upon application to the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare in Japan. We do have the data, and if you're interested in long-term care research, please don't hesitate for reaching out. So just summarizing the structure of the long-term care insurance system, but we'd better not ignore a very important sector of population who also providing long-term care, but informally. I think family members are taking the care duty pretty much, and they're somehow not very much studied in the literature of long-term care. In fact, the size of informal caregivers in Japan is 7 times as many as formal care workers. So their well-beings, their life qualities, their labor force performances are really important topic to investigate on. Who are the informal caregivers in Japan? Based on this bar chart, we can find basically their spouses, most likely their spouses of the elderly person. So in Japanese, it's very famous phenomenon of elderly care. So elderly is taking care of another elderly. of their spouses, followed by their sons or daughters, their children. So family members in intimated relationships are very much into this care providing procedures. And when we talk about long-term care, formal versus informal, we're always interested how much the services are used. Are people, recipients, relying on one of them? But actually in Japan, it's kind of shared. So even people are very much enjoying utilizing formal long-term care services, their family members, their spouses are still taking care of them. As we always say that there's no very clear definition of what is long-term care. It's more like daily stuff that you should pay attention to elderly people in care needs 24 hours. So as you can find from these two bar charts, for those who population aged 85 and above, 46% of them are utilizing both formal and informal care services. It's very stable, but slightly increased for the population aged 85 plus. The largest change is for the nursing home proportion. They are more likely to be institutionalized. Okay, the last part of the presentation is talking about the challenge of the system. I would say the key words for the challenge is the sustainability, as I repeated several times. The first challenge for sustainability is the financial sustainability of the system. Given the stagnation of Japan's economy, how to make such a generous system sustainable is really a problem. As we can find, the share of GDP spent on long-term care insurance increased how many times? More than triples, I think. At the starting point, it was below 1%, but in the latest 2019, it's beyond 2% of the GDP. There are several reforms actually attempting to maintain the financial sustainability of the system. Basically, they're aiming on shifting to services with relatively lower costs, increasing the premiums, particularly for those working still workforce of the labor market, the secondary insurers, or they're increasing the co-insurance rates, particularly for those who recipients with more income, affluent, or they're with lower care needs. This, I borrowed this table from one of my papers talking about the reforms in 2006. In this reform, the services for the lightest care needs level, support requirement level 1, were drastically limited in order to reduce the costs spending on those types of care, care recipients. But still, I think the government is working very hard on seeking for not optimal, but balanced policy that do not hurt the welfare of elderly people, but meanwhile sustain the program for a longer period. Another issue regarding sustainability is the lack of human resources. As we know, Japan is not an immigration-friendly country, and given the aging population, those younger cohorts who involved in the industry, long-term care industry, is decreasing, I would say. But there are a lot of policies regarding how to increase the labor resources involved in the industry. The government is compensating for formal care workers with relatively higher salary compared to the past years, adopting robotics, particularly like this type of assisting system for female workers who are very much involved in the industry, lightening their physical labor, physical burden on their body, adapting foreign care workers, particularly from Southeast Asia, I would say, and lowering the admin duties for the care managers when they deal with all those plans. But still, it's upon discussion for all those challenges, and a lot of research questions can really be raised from this status quo of the situations. That's all for presentations, but I'm very open for any questions or clarifications. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hu. She gave very detailed and thorough, explanation about the long-term care program in Japan. It's very informative, and I learned a lot. Okay, so in the interest of time, I think we should move to the next presentation. So next presenter is Professor Yen-hsin Alice Cheng at Academia Sinica, Taiwan. So her research interests are family demography, adolescent development, and life course research. And her recent research projects focus on some of the broad topics such as contemporary family family transitions in Taiwan and low fertility issues in developed societies, and demographic research on disadvantaged groups in Taiwan, and so on. And she earned her PhD in sociology and demography from the Pennsylvania State University in the United States. So I think she is joining using a different web conference program. So I hope that the technical transition goes smoothly. But anyway, Professor Cheng, yeah, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Okay, I think there's some time lag.
Yeah, I can see you and hear you.
Okay, sounds good. So thank you, and I'm very honored to be invited to this symposium. And I'm going to share with you my PowerPoint slide. If there's any problem, please tell me. Okay, so I suppose everyone can see the slide clearly now. Is it showing up okay?
Not yet. I can only see myself.
Okay.
Oh yeah, it's on. Yeah, I can see now. Yeah.
Okay, so I hope the time lag is not too bad. So can I start
I
now?
think yeah. Yes, we can start.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about how division of labor at home affects fertility intentions using data from Taiwan. So this is already a published work, and it's something that I think is relevant for all these pronatalist policies that are being implemented in East Asia. So first of all, let's take a look at the phenomenon in East Asia or all over the globe. So we know that period total fertility rates have fallen to lowest low levels in many countries in the past decades, and in particularly since 1990s, the fertility rates in East Asia has also been dropping very rapidly. And we noticed that some countries have witnessed a reversal of total fertility rates with the weakening of the postponement, putting off having children. Postponement means putting off having children, the timing effect. But however, other countries we have seen very limited rebound, such as in Korea, in Japan, and in Taiwan, Hong Kong as well. So most of these countries with limited rebound of fertility rates are located in Southern Europe or in East Asia. So oftentimes demographers have argued that gender equality is at the core of such different fertility outcomes. And what kind of gender equality are they talking about? They're basically saying about the division at home is critical. And so countries where men and women share more equally at home regarding domestic chores, they often see more sustainable fertility levels in their own population. So the question is that, is there a stalled gender revolution in Taiwan? So what we're seeing is there's this persistently unequal division of domestic work between spouses. And this is often linked to low fertility rates for a persistent long period of time. And this is particularly severe in countries with traditional gender norms. So this has been documented in past research. And in fact, in Taiwan, women still shoulder the bulk of domestic chores and shoulder the main responsibility for taking care of their children in Taiwan. So here is a graph that I used that is plotting using data from the panel study of family dynamics database. So we're seeing the lines are reflecting different birth cohorts. So the earliest cohort born before 1949, there basically the woman in that cohort is shouldering nearly 80% of the household chores, and this pattern didn't change much up until the latest youngest cohort who were born after 1984. This brown line here, it's only been down to 67% or so. There are some decline, but the scope is not very impressive. And when we look across East Asia, we see that South Korea in particular have this highest share of domestic chores among women. The situation is slightly better in Japan and Taiwan, but the decline is also not very big. The regions or countries with better or more egalitarian division of labor is observed in Hong Kong and in China. And of course, these are influenced by the socialist system as well as the colonial past of Hong Kong. Basically, there's some important motivations to do this study. One of the key question is that does division of labor affect married women's fertility intentions in Taiwan? And so what we're seeing now in current research are some limitations that have been observed in the literature. There are two of them. One is the region-wise limitation, and the other one is theory-wise. When we're talking about region-wise, we're talking about there's very limited research on division of labor and how it affects fertility intentions or the actual childbearing behaviors in East Asia. And ironically, East Asia is also a region with one of the lowest period total fertility rates in the world, but this line of research is still relatively limited. And theory-wise, what we're seeing in all these existing Western research on how division of labor affects fertility intentions or behaviors is that most of the time, the educational level of the mothers have been ignored. It seems like researchers think that how well educated a woman is doesn't really affect her fertility intentions, and along with the fact that whether she receives a lot or very little help from her husband. But there's very good reason to believe that women's or mothers' education attainment matters, and it will have important policy implications. So let's take a brief look at the current literature. So what we're seeing is that between gender equality, division of labor, and fertility intentions, it has been shown that couples with more gender egalitarian attitudes and equal division of domestic work have better relationship quality. And they also tend to have stronger fertility intentions than other couples without consistent egalitarian attitudes and behaviors. And also, and what we need to notice is that time spent on housework and childcare tended to increase with the coming of a newborn. And this is particularly the case for women, and not so much for the man or the husband in that family who is already having a child. And then the positive effect of spousal chore sharing on fertility appears to be task specific. So when we're talking about task specific, here we're referring to the fact that your spouse can share child rearing task, or he can share this household or housekeeping chores. So it seems that spousal sharing of childcare matters more than sharing housework. And a husband's help with childcare, they have a very distinct positive effect to really raise the likelihood of a second birth in Germany, Italy, Finland, Norway, and Spain. That's what we have seen in the existing research. But like I said earlier, there's no much research in East Asia regarding this association between spouse chore sharing versus women's fertility intentions. And then we briefly take a look at why education matters. So this can be thought about from two perspectives, from the socialization perspective and from the structuralist perspective. So from the formal perspective, education is related. It matters for fertility intention because women who are better educated, they tend to envision more equality at home. Their idea of ideal relationship involves more equal sharing of power, of resources, and of chores at home. And from a structuralist perspective, higher opportunity cost can be expected for tertiary educated women versus the kind of opportunity cost for much less educated women. So these are two important reasons for why we think that education should be taken as an important moderator when we are looking at the relationship between spousal chore sharing versus women's fertility intention. And perceptions of gender equity and the work-family balance tend to be more of a challenge for well-educated women than others. And this is particularly the case in traditional societies with rigid institutional arrangements. And this is exactly the kind of context that all the participants of this symposium is experiencing. This is pretty much the case in East Asia and also very similarly in Southern Europe, where the imaginations or the kind of ideal wifehood or motherhood is still relatively traditional. And the institution has been slow to adapt to women's rising or changing roles in the society. Okay, so next we're gonna take a quick look at how Taiwan has changed over the past decades. So since the 1970s, there is very rapid industrialization and economic development in Taiwan. And both of these sort of speed up the demand for skilled laborers, and thus it's really prompted the first wave of educational expansion in Taiwan. And later on in the 1990s, there's second wave. But regardless, both waves have really led to the fact that the proportion of men and women aged 15 to 49 with tertiary education has really rose rapidly from around 3 to 6% in 1975 to about 45% in 2015. And this kind of improved human capital also benefited women's employment prospects by raising their labor force participation rates. For those aged 25 to 29, what we're seeing is their labor force participation rate rose from 41% in 1978 to more than 90% in 2015. So this kind of social change is co-occurring with this fact that fertility rates have plummeted over the past decade, from 4 children in 1970 to only 1 child in 2020. And last year it was only 0.98. And this is this kind of extremely low period total fertility rates have been observed across all East Asian societies. And simultaneously, it's also this really fast declining marriage rate that is taking place at the same time. So even with these events going on, what we're seeing is that women, they progress in paid employment. They are much better educated. At the same time, the younger generations of men are also contributing more than the older generation to domestic work. But in 2016, we're still seeing that women contributed almost 80% to total housework hours in Taiwan. Okay, so on the research question for this empirical study is that we want to ask how do wives' trait and couple characteristics affect domestic division of labor. So we want to see what are the factors that affect the division of labor at home. This is first step. And the second question, we want to explore how does domestic division of labor in terms of dividing housework task and childcare task. They're looked at together and separately in our models, empirical models later. And we want to know how they affect women's fertility intentions in Taiwan. And with this kind of, we explore this association. And then in the meantime, we want to know, does this link vary by women's educational attainment? And whether it matters what kind of domestic work a husband share. Okay, so these are our key questions. And I'm going to go through the research design of this study. So the data comes from the 2016 Women's Marriage, Fertility, and Employment Survey, which was collected by the government, and it's a nationally representative sample of all 15 plus married and unmarried women, and the sample were nearly 15,000. And the WMFE survey is a long-running repeated cross-sectional survey since the 1980s, but only until 2016 have we seen that husband's domestic work hours included in the questionnaire for the very first time. And this is why we only use this wave of data. The analytical sample is restricted to women between the age of 15 to 49 at parity 1. So to enter our study, you have to have at least one child. And then the child, and no matter how many you have, one of them has to be under 18 years of age. And why do we limit to women with children? Because transition from 0 to 1 child, the kind of increase in childcare task is not is of different nature from when you already have one child and versus you are considering whether to have a second child or not. So when you transition from the status of no childcare task in the household, it's very difficult to evaluate whether your husband whether he shares a childcare task or not affect your intentions to have child, because basically there's no childcare task when you are parity 0. Okay, so the dependent variable is how many children do you intend to have in the future. So when the woman indicates she wants to have at least one child in the future, she will receive a dummy code as 1, otherwise 0. Independent variables, we have wife's daily domestic work hours. We put hours on housework and hours on childcare together, and also we separate them in different models. And then we also have this indicator for percentage husband's domestic work hours separately for housework and childcare as well. And then the control variables, we have parity, whether a woman is parity 0, 1, 2, 3. No, parity 1, 2, 3. There's no parity 0. Whether she already had a son or not, because we know with the idea of son preference, it also affect women's fertility intention. So we have to control for this. And then wife's income share, wife's work hour shares, wife's age, wife's education. And then there's this couple pairing characteristic of whether a spousal education gap is homogamous, hypergamous, or hypogamous. And also there's also age gap with the similar 3 categories. And finally, we use logistic regression and propensity score matching method to investigate our research questions. So first of all, this is the descriptive statistic. So we see that about 13% of these parity 1 women, parity 1 plus women, are they intend to have another child. This is not very high. And then husband on average share about 1/5 of housework or childcare. And the most of the analytical sample, they are parity 2 or 3 plus. And about 74% of them had a son. And their wife's income share is about 28%, and their share in working hours of the entire couple working hours about 35%. So wife's age distribution is like this. Most of the over half of them were between the age of 30 to 39, and another quarter between 40 to 44. And in terms of spousal age differences, over 60% of them were in the hypergamous union, where the husband's age is older than wife. In terms of educational levels, they're about almost half of the women had a tertiary education, and also slightly over half of the couples, they are in a homogamous union, meaning their education level is the same: high school versus high school, college versus college, graduate school versus graduate school, etc. So the first step, we want to look at what affects a husband's housework input. So we see that in model 1, higher parity is negatively related to husband's share in domestic work. So is wife's older age. However, women's higher education, higher income share, and higher working hours are positively related to husband's domestic share, domestic work share. And when we break down the kind of task into housework or childcare, we see that the parity effect is mainly driven by the patterns we observed for housework sharing. And the age effect is mainly about childcare. So what we're seeing is that older women who were basically marrying older cohorts of men who tend to be more traditional, these men were sharing much fewer domestic work. Next is our second set of questions. So we want to ask how is a wife's fertility intention affected by all these different variables we include, and of them, the key variables of interest is husband's share. So it's their share in housework and childcare combined, and the second one is their share in housework and share in childcare, and there's this interaction term of husband's share interacting with tertiary educated wife. So we're seeing here is the husband's share in housework matters, but this is particularly the case for tertiary educated wife. And this first 3 models refers to all kinds of domestic work combined. So then we want to know this kind of positive effects, where does it come from? So we then, models 4, 5, 6, we only looked at husband's share in housework. So we see that there are basically no effects of how a husband share domestic housework and whether it will affect their spouse's fertility intention. But when we only looked at husband's share in childcare, we see that this positive effect and significant interaction effect comes up again. So basically what we're seeing in models 1 and 3 is mainly driven by husband's share in childcare. And so this is similar to some of the patterns found in a number of European countries I mentioned earlier. And then here we see that never having a son also matters. Women sharing working hours also matters a bit. And then tertiary educated women have more significant effect. Then because the fact that the likelihood of marrying a man who are willing to share housework and having a stronger fertility intention, they might be affected by the same set of factors. So the next step what we're trying to do is to do a pseudo randomized matching. So we match women on traits such as age, education, parity, etc. The key covariates included in the models. And this is using this propensity score matching method. And we want to see how the so-called treatment, there's a cutoff of husband shares more than 20% of child care time. And we use this as the treatment because I believe 50% of the sample have a husband who share 20% of child care time, or maybe another percentage. There's a rationale for choosing this cutoff point. So what we're seeing here is that for when we're looking at all the couples, there's this average treatment effect that is significant at parity 1. So these are women who already have one child. And this a very similar average treatment effect is also found for tertiary educated parity 1 wives. But we don't see a similar ATT average treatment effect for non-tertiary educated wives in this propensity score matching analysis. So we see that it's parity 1 that matters. So if if a woman already have 2 children, and her husband is making lots of effort trying to share childcare task, what we're seeing here is that it wouldn't increase her fertility intention to have a 3rd child. But this kind of husband sharing matters for having the 2nd child for among parity 1 women, and this is particularly the case for tertiary educated mothers. And so on the other side of the story is that we can also say that if less educated women had a husband who is willing to share housework, will their fertility intentions be stronger? No. So this counterfactual analysis tells us the answer is no. Okay, so this will be my final slide. So I briefly summarize the key findings of this study. So we see that the positive impact of husband's input into childcare on his wife's fertility intention was mostly restricted to parity 1 couples, but not those of higher parities. And also, this is very similar to the patterns reported in Finland and Italy. The positive effect of childcare sharing from fathers' fertility was mainly found among tertiary educated mothers who were more likely to form unions with helpful partners. And we are also seeing that even 20% of childcare sharing from husband could raise fertility intentions for wife. This shows us really it's a feeling of fairness rather than absolute equal division of labor that matters for mothers with young children. And the fertility intentions of less educated mothers, they were very likely motivated by factors other than division of labor at home, since they might be more accustomed to traditional gender roles and have less bargaining power when facing an unequal division of labor. What the crucial thing that they're lacking is more likely financial well-being. So it's really a matter of money, whether they can afford a 2nd, 3rd child among these less educated mothers. So these findings really tells us that pronatalist policies aiming to boost fertility will likely need to offer different combinations of parental leave and financial aid packages to women with different education for the optimal policy effectiveness, because the different sectors of the mother population really seems like having different needs when they are considering having more children. So even if fathers can have paid parental leave, it might only increase the fertility intentions of highly educated mothers, but not those with less education. So aside from the theoretical implication of this study for really taking into account mothers' education, I think the findings also bear some critical policy implications. And this is my presentation for today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Cheng, for the very interesting presentation and work with important policy implications. I think we can talk more about the paper and the presentation later. So let's move on to our today's final presentation. The presenter is Professor Susanne Yuk-ping Choi at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She's a professor in the Department of Sociology there, and she's also a co-director of Gender Research Center at the Hong Kong Institute of Asia Pacific Studies at the CUHK. So her current research interests includes not limited to gender, sexuality, family, migration, social justice and work, and so on. So yeah, okay, without further ado, we're here from Professor Choi. Okay, Professor, I think I cannot hear your voice. Okay, now it's working.
Okay, so you can hear me, yeah? Okay,
Yes.
so yeah, I think I'm going to share my slide, but then I think there's some problem with, okay, can you see my slide?
Yes, I can see it.
Yeah.
But it's not the first page. I think it's
the last one.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you very much. So today I'm going to, but I think my discussion in the echo quite a lot, Professor Alice Jan's discussion, but I'm looking at it from another perspective, not from the effectiveness of the population policy, but rather on its impacts on gender equality. And this is because of my background on gender research. So today what I'm going to present is indeed a paper that I co-authored with two of my PhD students, Ms. Tsai Xiaoming and Ms. Chen Lingxi, and our paper is entitled Pronatalism, China's Three-Child Policy and Gender Equality, Feminist Institutional Analysis. So I think if we want to talk about China's three-child policy, I think one thing which is the background information is really important is that China has experienced very dramatic fertility decline. In 1970, the total fertility rate in China was 5.81, but it dropped to 2.75 in 1979. And in the 1980s, the total fertility rate fluctuated above the replacement level. But since the 1990s, the total fertility rate has dropped to below the replacement level. And now the current fertility rate in China is around 1.7. So I think when we are talking about pronatalism, maybe we can also think a little bit more about what does it mean. Pronatalism refers to pro-birth ideologies, and which can manifest, for example, in individual aspirations, cultural norms, or state policies, laws, and discourses. Historically, I think we can identify three forms of pronatalism. The first one is what scholars often call coercive pronatalism, and this is often associated with far-right, very conservative family and gender norms, and also associated with racism and eugenicism. Usually, this type of policies they will want to improve or increase the birth of some specific population, but they are also anti-natalist of some other groups which I consider inferior. And then so the second type of pronatalism is what we call pronatalism and motherhood mandate. Is that often the pro-birth ideology is associated citizenship to their role as mothers. Or, for example, will link motherhood to heterosexual marriage. So, and then at the expense of single motherhood, or the motherhood of lesbian women. And the third types of pronatalism is what we call target-driven pronatalism. This means that the governments have a very clear target, and then they implement policies to increase or to meet the targets of population birth. Because of its association with racism or imperialism or eugenicism, coercive pronatalism, I think very few countries will talk about this explicitly now. And but of course, pronatalism and motherhood mandate has still remained quite common, underscoring a lot of the population policies. But most countries now have what we so-called target-driven pronatalism. But even target-driven pronatalism, they have received quite a lot of criticism recently, because a lot of the policies focus on, for example, increasing cash transfers or providing financial supports for new parents, for example, the baby bonuses in Singapore, or maternity capital in Russia, or interest-free loans in Hungary. But scholars evaluating the effectiveness of this target-driven pronatalism argue that it's not very effective and it's very costly. In most cases, they may increase, they may change the timing or the spacing of childbirth, but then in the long term, they don't increase the total number of childbirth. So since the 1990s, there's an international discussion about maybe we need to have a new paradigm on population policies. Instead of focusing on meeting a certain population targets, maybe the focus should be on reproductive empowerment. And so, for example, in the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development, the focus is really on about how do we realize and empower individuals to realize their reproductive goal on the basis of human rights, dignity, and gender equity within the context of reproductive health and rights. So I think this is a quite interesting paradigm shift from very concerned about the numbers of birth and to the really principles underscoring the policy. So in this presentation, I will adopt this the principles of this new paradigm. Okay, so this new paradigm of population policies, I think the policy goals, as I mentioned, are not about increasing a specific targets of population growth or meeting a specific target, but the broad policy goals are about enhancing reproductive health, promoting gender equality, and also safeguarding individuals, particularly children's and families' well-being. And then when the states, the governments implement policies, they usually focus on family policies. But the rationale of family policies are again not about meeting a specific population growth targets, but on the rationale of equality and child health and development. And so family policies implemented underscored by this new paradigm, they emphasize inclusiveness and gender sensitivity. So for example, they want a policy to cater to the needs of different population groups, including the disadvantaged one and also minorities. And also about gender sensitivity, they will take into consideration existing gender inequalities in the labor markets and also in the family. And then the goals of the family policy is really about increasing equality. So a lot of the focuses of these policies are about how to, for example, reduce gender inequality in the labor market and in the family. And countries adopting this new paradigm, for example, I think Scandinavian countries in Europe, they promote a so-called dual earner and dual carer model. So this model has two broad aims. The first one is to reduce or eliminate barriers to mothers' labor market participation, and also to reduce the penalties that mothers will experience in the labor markets because of their childbirth and care responsibilities. And then the second policy goal would be to facilitate fathers' participation in childcare, so to reduce gender inequalities in unpaid work in the family. And so, for example, when they introduce parental leave, they also introduce a quota that requires fathers to take up a certain percentage of the parental leave. So when, of course, it's very difficult to really evaluate the consequence of or the impacts of a policy, not to mention because we are doing this in China, which is a huge country with, populations, a large population, and also there's a lot of rural-urban inequalities and regional differences. But when we are thinking how to evaluate the policies, we try to incorporate multi-dimensions. The first dimension is that we look at the materialistic dimensions of pronatalism in China, meaning we look at the laws and regulations implemented by the state. But we also look at the symbolic dimensions, referring to the discourses by, for example, prominent government officials or politicians. Because research in, for example, in Turkey and other countries have shown that sometimes the laws and legislations, they may not change, but because of pronatalist discourses, it actually have impacts on gender equality. For example, in Turkey, while abortion has remained legal, but because government officials and also prominent politicians, they have often talked about that abortion is against the national interest, and then so it results in a lot of local, for example, healthcare provisioners. They reduce provision for access to abortion. And so that's why we think that, in the presentation, you will see that we look at not only policies and laws, we also look at, the discourses of the state. And when we're talking about pronatalist policies, there's some direct policies, but there's also indirect policies. And we also will look at both, these two types of policies. And then finally, in terms of consequence, of course, policies will have direct consequence, but for sociologists, we also think it's really important to look at unintended consequence. For example, I will give an example of China's one-child policy. Of course, the one-child policy implemented in the 1980s, the intended consequence was reduce childbirth. But then later scholars discovered there's an unintended consequence, which is to improve women's status, especially in the urban area. So in the presentation in this paper, we also both look at consider the direct or intended consequence and then unintended consequence. So I think before we talk about China, I would like to first, for example, look at the evidence from other countries. And because coercive pronatalism, I think they have been out of date, so we don't include here. But so we look at two main types of pronatalism, target-driven pronatalism and reproductive empowerment. And also the policies, we look at direct policies and indirect policies. Target-driven pronatalism, as I just said, they usually implement two types of policies. The first one is financial support and transfer for childbirth. And the second one is the policies to restrict access to abortion and family planning. And in terms of these causes, target-driven pronatalism, they are often associated with two types of discourses. One is motherhood mandate, meaning that they often send a message to women that is their, citizenship obligation to have children to help improve the strength of the nation. And then they are often also associated with ethno-nationalism, because a lot of the discussion and the discourses are really not about individuals and their well-being, but about the strength of the nation. But on the other hand, reproductive empowerment, they seldom have direct pro-birth policies, but instead they have indirect policies, which, for example, related to childcare services. They will provide comprehensive, universal, and affordable childcare services, which are publicly funded. And also they have parental leave schemes. In many countries, the parental leave schemes, they also have a father quota, as to ensure that men really make use of the parental leave schemes and to actively involve and participate in childcare and to equalize domestic division of labor. And also, they have universal access to reproductive and health services. And because for the reproductive empowerment, the goal is really not about meeting a population targets of childbirth. So they don't really have this, for example, motherhood mandate or ethno-nationalism. The discourses is really about gender equality, reproductive health, and also maybe other forms of equality, inclusiveness, the well-being of individuals and family. So, okay. So in our research, we adopt a feminist institutional analysis. And this, I will briefly talk about this. This is based on sociologist Sylvia Warby's book on theorizing patriarchy. And in this book, Sylvia Warby argues that if we want to understand gender relationship, we have to look at not only patriarchy, but also its interaction with capitalism and racism. And even in the system of patriarchy, she differentiates 6 substructures: the mode of production, relations and pay work, the state, male violence, sexuality, and cultural productions. I think the 3 substructures are particularly relevant to our research. The first one is about gender domestic division of labor in the family. The second one is about gender inequalities in the labor markets. And the third one is about gender state power and policies. And Sylvia Warby argues that a lot of social changes are really resulted from uneven changes and tension between different substructures. And I think this echoes, for example, demographers like Peter McDonald's argument that fertility decline is often the results between women's increasing opportunities in education and the labor markets, and then the lacking behind of gender norms regarding their roles in the family. And so we think that this is a really insightful framework. And so we will adopt it to really analyzing how, for example, we can understand the impacts of China's 3-child policy by looking at how gender norms shape state policies, labor markets, and the family, and how in turn the interactions between these 2 institutions shape or mediate the impacts of the 3-child policy on gender equality. Okay, so I think I will talk quickly about the history of China as reproductive engineering. So China implemented the 1-child policy. So this is really interesting. It's anti-natalist in the 1980s. And then a lot of scholars argue that this policy has a eugenic undertone because the policy emphasis is for less birth, but superior birth. So there's a lot of talk about the quality of the population. And this policy is also instrumentalist and nationalistic because its major concern is about meeting the human resources advantage of China and also to enshrine China, as national strength. And this policy, when it was implemented, there's a lot of evidence of coercive enforcement because in many regions, scholars documented forced sterilization or forced abortion. And then, but even the Chinese government was forced to slowly adjust their policy because of traditional Chinese societies' strong pronatalist and son preference tendencies, especially in the rural areas. So we then later seen a lot of adjustments of the policy. For example, in rural areas, couples whose first birth is a girl, later they were allowed to have a second birth. And also, the coercive enforcement was slowly and gradually phased out. But in because of in 2013, then China have a new policy, which is called Dandu two-child policy, which allows the second childbirth for couples with any spouses being a singleton. And so the early adjustments was only relevant to rural population, but now this is a universal adjustment that is relevant to all population in China. And in this policy statement, it in particular highlighted the rationales before this policy shift. There are four rationales. The first one is declining GDP growth since 2010. And then the second one is decrease of working age population and increase of aging population. And so many local governments, they also have a pension crisis. And also the continuance of a high sex ratio at birth that bias towards males. And then in 2016, then China then implement a universal two-child policy because the population decline has accelerated. But unfortunately, the outcomes of this two-child policy fell short of the official expectation about the fertility rise. So that's why we see in 2021 May, the government then implement a universal three-child policy. So if we look at about this universal, there's a typo error, it's not three-child policy. We look at the direct policies. There's a so-called guiding opinions on further improving and implementing measures for supporting active childbearing. So this focus on few aspects. The first one is, to have guidelines on childbirth leave arrangements. And then the second one is childbirth insurance, for example, to cover some of the medical causes of childbirth, and also childbirth allowances, and to urge companies, to improve their breastfeeding facilities, and also urge companies and enterprise to implement family-friendly workplace policies. But we can also see that there's a lot of indirect policies. There's the law on the protection of the rights and interests of women, and also the outline for women's development in China, 2021 to 2030. And I will elaborate, about actually what are the concrete policy contents of these two policies. But although these policies address, try to reduce gender inequalities in the labor markets, particularly focusing on reducing discrimination, for example, against pregnant women. But the discourse has remained quite focused on, population structure or national growth. So it has remained a very nationalist discourse rather than, focusing more on gender equality. Okay, so there's a lot of concern after the government implement this or announce this policy. There's a lot of public concerns about how this policy will impact on women's reproductive autonomy. Because of the legacy of the one-child policy, access to legal and affordable and high-quality abortion services and family planning services in China have been implemented and for example, these services are provided by public hospitals, private hospitals, and even NGOs. But there's a widespread concern that whether the state will tighten or restrict women's access to abortion and contraception. We already see a little bit of this happening. For example, in the implementation of the three-child policy, there's already inclusion of provisions to reduce abortions that are not medically necessary. And so this is the first sign that a lot of people are worrying. The second aspect is that even after the implementation of the two-child policy, scholars have already observed that women, they face increased fertility pressure. For example, among those who have less desire for a second childbirth, and also increased fertility anxiety for those who do wish to have a one. And scholars also, argue that a lot of the pressure and anxiety that Chinese women face after the implementation of the two-child policy is related to a combination of so-called Confucian patriarchy, which has remained positioning women's dominant role within the family and their, obligation as mothers, and so-called state patriarchy, which defines women's citizenship to their, motherhood. And we can see that there's a lot of discourses, which is, making scholars concerned about this or the public concern. For example, fertility decline in China has been framed as women's problems. There's intensified blame on women without intention for marriage or without intention to have more children. I know there's a popular, some, for example, state media blame women for being selfish. And also state media urge local governments to promote the so-called greatness of reproduction and motherhood and to reduce exaggerated accounts of reproductive anxiety. And also in some areas, there's already online censorship. Some online forums where women express unwillingness to get married or to give birth have already been censored since 2021. Now, let's quickly look at the potential impact of three-child policy on gender inequalities in the labor markets. We all know that gender equality is a basic national policy in China, which is enshrined in the constitution. And the Chinese government also have, implemented laws, for example, the labor protection regulations, the labor law, and special rules on the labor protection for female employees. Sorry, I think apparently my time is just being very quick. Okay. But we also have observed that since the economic reforms, China's, the gender equality in the labor market, the statistics from China are quite different from the global trend. For example, we observe, declining female labor force participation in China from the 1990s to 2019. We also observe the widening gender wage gap in China, that the gap is particularly pronounced in rural areas. Okay, so why, for example, when gender equality is enshrined in the constitutions and when there's different types of laws to protect gender equality or women's rights in the labor markets, we have still witnessed persistent workplace gender discrimination and inequalities. Scholars argue that this is because China lacks particular ordinances or lacks specific definitions about discriminatory practices. And there's also often ineffective enforcement, and because there's no specific mechanisms or institutional setups to enforce all the guidelines. So in some, a lot of the talks or states' positions about gender equality, they exist in the forms of very general guidelines without the specifics for implementations. So that's why scholars observe a huge gap between the state's policy or its goal for gender equality and local implementation. For example, after the two-child policy, some companies even set up so-called pregnancy queue, meaning to limit the number of pregnant workers in a given time. And this really increased female employees' anxiety about the impacts of their childbirth will have on their career. We are quite concerned about the further impacts of three-child policy on gender inequalities in the labor market, because it may change employers' expectation. Employers may anticipate higher costs for human capital development or the human capital development of female employees because of this three-child policy. It may also shape employees' choices. Women who anticipate second or third childbirth may then intentionally choose jobs which are lower pay and with lower prospects, but give them more flexibilities. And we're also quite concerned about whether this three-child policy will widen inequalities between state and non-state sectors, and also widen regional inequalities with respect to women's labor force participation rates and labor market attainments. Finally, I will say a little bit about three-child policy and gender inequalities in the family. What I would say would just echo what Professor Alice Cheng has presented. So although China's situation may be slightly better than other East Asian countries in terms of men's participation in domestic work, but I think domestic work, especially care work, has remained, a very feminist type of work with the burden that falls disproportionately on the shoulders of women. In Chinese societies, family usually have three types of childcare support. One is generational based, which with grandparenting, that is, filling the childcare gap. The second one is state support, but this has witnessed a lot of decline because after the economic reform, there's a privatization, and then state is withdrawing slowly from public childcare support. And so in the place of the state withdrawal, then we have seen increase in market provisions, but these are often costly and their safety and quality raises a lot of concerns. Okay, so I think if we want to understand how the three-child policy will impact on gender equalities in the family, I think we have also need to look at how Chinese families have changed. Anthropologist Yen-hsin argues that the Chinese families have changed a lot since the economic reform and towards what he identifies as neo-feminism. And neo-feminism, according to Professor Yang, has four characteristics. One is called descending feminism, in meaning it's becoming really child-centered. And of course, then this will place increasing demands on, parenting, especially on intensive mothering. The second one is about there's an intimate turn. So there's a lot of emphasis on emotional bonding among family members, and this also may increase the emotional care work, and also it particularly will influence mothers. The third one is about materialism. Increasingly, Chinese families' esteem and reputation is defined by its ability to accumulate wealth, and this has led to overworking of fathers to make money, and of course, then this may possibly reduce paternal involvement in childcare. And then the fourth aspect, which we found really interesting, is about intensified tension between individual and family interests. As I say, although the state has emphasis a lot about women's citizenship as mothers, but then we also witness a lot of younger generation women protesting against the state's ideology, and also women are resisting the pressure from their husbands and in-laws to have more children. And I guess this is because Chinese women also their educational attainments increased quite dramatically since the 1990s because of huge and rapid expansion of the higher education. Okay, so I think I will conclude my presentation here is that I think it's still premature to really conclude what the implications of China's three-child policy on, for example, women's reproductive autonomy and gender inequalities in the labor markets and in the family. But I think overall, I think it would be very productive if we have adopt an institutional analysis that will look at, for example, how culture norms shape the major institutions and how these major institutions, for example, the state, the markets, and the family interact, then mediate the impacts of the three-child policy on gender equality. So thank you so much, and I apologize for overrunning a little bit.
Hey, thank you very much, Professor, for a very interesting presentation. Don't need to be sorry about it. Okay, so yeah, actually, this is actually we're at the time when we should, wrap up our symposium, and but at least we should answer to some of the questions raised in the. So in the YouTube, there was a student who asked questions to Professor Rong. So I actually copied and pasted the questions in the chat. Have you had time to check it? Okay, so the question briefly was basically it was two questions. The first one is, I know how the care is very much outsourced in some countries and possibly Japan as well. I wonder if you can account for anything you know regarding the outsourced long-term care. What happens when a caregiver is a foreigner in Japan? Does the same process still apply for those insured? Second one is, what are the options for the elderly choose to be cared outside of home, willing to choose or shop for the care institutions outside of their home? Professor, can you briefly answer to these questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for very good questions for clarifications. For the first question, foreigner as a caregiver, I'm not sure whether you're talking about the formal caregivers as immigrant foreigners, but if that's the case, I'm a little bit lost about the second one, because does the same process still apply for those insured? I think if you're talking about formal caregivers who are coming from other countries, it's basically treated the same as the formal caregivers, domestic formal caregivers, because the long-term care insurance is basically covering all those costs, regardless of the nationality of the formal caregivers. But I would say that to get a license or certificate to be a formal care worker in Japan is super difficult because all the tests are in Japanese. So once you really want to work in Japan as a foreigner, the first step is not learning those techniques to taking care of someone, but the language. So I would say it's very challenging for the formal care workers as foreigners in Japan, but basically the steps are exactly the same for the domestic workers. But as a foreigner, if you're talking about foreigner as a consumer of the long-term care services, I would say it's exactly also the same, as long as you're insured into the long-term care insurance systems. So it's not discriminating based on your nationality at all. The second question is about outsourcing the care duties to not at home, but institutions, right? There are basically two types of nursing homes in Japan. Private or public, but it's a super long waiting list for public nursing homes in Japan. Only those who with means test, not really means test, but their incomes are relatively lower than the average, and really no one can afford for your private nursing home expenses. You will be allocated in a waiting list for public nursing homes, but usually you have to wait at least a year until you can really enroll into any nursing homes in Japan if it's public. If it's private, a lot of vacancy. You can free to choose any nursing homes you want to be in. And I think the equipment or all the environments are very, very nice. Staff there are very nice, very kind, taking care of you 24 hours, but it's very expensive. As far as I know, I learned from one of my colleagues, her mother is staying in a private nursing home, and monthly cost is over 20 万yen, so 200,000 Japanese yen per month. It's still reaching almost average income for Japanese population. So basically, older people are using all of their pensions or even savings if they want to stay in private nursing homes. Not sure whether it's informative, but that's my response. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Yes, to my understanding, the so-called the kaigo problem in Japan is a very important social issue, and I heard that you need a lot of foreign care workers to because there basically is a shortage of care workers in Japan because there are so many old people. So to take care of all of them, you have to rely on foreign caregivers. But as you said, they have to take Japanese exams, and training those foreign immigrants, it costs a lot of money, so it's not an easy process. So I understand it is a very complicated process. So for other professors, there were no like questions from YouTube, but I cannot just let you go. So I have just very quick just clarifying questions for the two presenters. For Professor Alice Cheng, your question was basically it's based on very rigorous analysis of survey data. And I was just wondering, so your main finding was that, you know, husbands in the share of housework, that effect on fertility intention is most kind of significant and prominent among the women with tertiary education. Do you know any other kind of similar findings or studies based on other societies? Because that would be a very, very important kind of thing. And also, on the other hand, do you think that kind of significant effect among tertiary educated women, do you think that effect would be even more stronger, like higher or stronger even among women with tertiary education with employment, you know, compared to, women with tertiary education without employment? So yeah, that is my question.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Im, for your question. Like I mentioned earlier, this similar patterns were reported in both Finland and Italy. And of course, Finland is probably a bit less relevant for East Asia, but the fact that Italy found similar things that would sort of make me expect that if there were similar kind of data available in Japan and let's say Korea, maybe we'll find the same things. Because normally family demographers in particular think that Southern European countries are quite similar to East Asian countries in terms of their collectivist culture, and the fact that the marriage of two persons is not really about two people. It's not really just these two individuals. It's a marriage of two families. So the parental values and expectations really have some non-neglectable impact on their adult children's decisions. So yes, similar findings were found. Well, in terms of the fact that husbands' tax sharing is particularly important in childcare, and that's what the childcare sharing of increases fertility intentions of women. Women's this kind of finding is found in Finland and Italy. But in terms of these educational variations in how the association between husband's health and fertility intention, I don't think I've seen similar findings in other countries. Like I said, this is one of the limitations in existing research. Basically, most researchers somehow just ignore this education effect and really not thinking about its moderating influence on the association. And the second question, whether this finding will vary for tertiary educated mothers with employment versus those without employment. To be honest, I didn't test this in my study, and I would expect that the effect would be probably stronger for those who are employed, because their time pressure and then the conflict between work and family is stronger. So I would expect that their husband's help matters more than those stay at home, better, well-educated mothers. That's my answer.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And I have a like quick question or comment to the last presentation, Professor Choi. So yeah, the Chinese case is very interesting. And just one thought that came to my mind was that probably the reason, you know, the government is using this, in some sense, kind of old style, old school kind of nationalist kind of language in, you know, promoting fertility, is partly due to maybe budget constraint, because, you know, to provide, you know, child, you know, care services and you know, promoting, you know, parental leaves and so forth and so forth. So all kinds of welfare policies, you know, child care policies are, need a lot of, you know, money basically. But to my understanding, you know, Chinese welfare state has been expanding, you know, continuously, but I don't know, it is still not there yet to, you know, to meet all the needs, you know, the needs of mothers and families. So in order to make up for that, you know, they they are relying on these kind of old ideology or paradigms, or family paradigms, or nationalist languages, in order to make up for the lack of budget. So I think in some sense it is their kind of strategic, I don't know, choice. What do you think?
I think this is really interesting. And I think it will not just really about China, it will also about a lot of middle income countries, because we have seen, for example, middle income countries like Russia or Turkey or you know, countries like Iran, and they all resort to using nationalist rhetorics to push or to give women pressure to have more children. And one of the reasons maybe is really budgetary constraints, but I also think it's really about the political culture as well. These countries, for example, China has been quite nationalistic, and even after the economic reform, and in particular in the last 10 years, you know, the so-called China dream and all this is really a very nationalistic discourse. So it could be about budgetary constraints, but it also could be echoing, you know, the overall political culture. But I think my concern, our concern as feminist scholars, is really about the marginalization of gender equality or individual human rights discourses in the national discourses. Because I think, as I know I presented, we are quite concerned about how this three-child policy will limit or restrict women's reproductive autonomy. Also, given that China has a history of, you know, coercive enforcement of population policies, and also, you know, given its political structure is, you know, yeah, we will be quite concerned about this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So it's way over, you know, our expected, you know, time. So I'm gonna wrap up today. Is there any like burning questions among the presenters, that you want to ask to other presenters? Okay, if not, then yeah, it's time to wrap up today's symposium. So I thank you all the three wonderful today's presenters, and all the audience on YouTube. So our Seoul National University Population Research Center has been holding this kind of symposium annually for 3 consecutive years so far, and we will do so in the for the at least next few years. So if you are interested in, we usually hold this kind of event in November or usually in December. So please, if you receive an email from us, please open and read. It's not a spam, so yeah, and check out the email. Okay, thank you very much, and I hope to see you all in person, whether in, I don't know, Korea, China, Taiwan, or wherever in the world. Okay, have a nice rest of the day, and I hope to see you all in the future. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.